This is Dev Branch number 22, WordPress terminology meta.
Meta what? Meta who?
I'm Jason Cosper. You can find me on Twitter at Booga.
That doesn't.
It seems like I'm the founder of Zeek Interactive and sometimes the leader of the OC WordPress meetup.
I am Say Reed, and I make WordPress, teach WordPress, tweet WordPress at Say Reed Media on all the things, mostly Twitter though. Ooh,
And
look,
you
follow.
can go ahead and if you have a podcast app, please add us to your podcast app. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, I guess, Google Podcasts, wherever podcasts are sold. Do not adjust your YouTube podcast app,
Headphones.
whatever, Twitch, wherever we're streaming. Jason Tucker
You follow
and
you
his
around.
infinite I don't know
Wisdom.
it's not really a
I was gonna go with
good idea.
neurotypicality because he has to be early for an appointment, and I was like, he's like, I can't leave. It's gonna take this long. I can't, leave late.
Yeah.
And I was like, you can't.
So he has put
Sounds like
me
plenty of time to get where you're going.
I'm
Why
sorry,
would
wait a
you
second.
be
Cosper's in
early?
charge?
yeah
I'm out.
I don't I mean
I'm a bounce. I'm out.
okay I mean
Okay.
Oh, he actually left.
Nice one.
He does have
Yeah.
all the power today. Today's
Yeah,
show
no,
is
Tucker-
Cosper fueled, so you need to understand. It's gonna
Tucker
be.
is letting me control the ones and twos, and we're in for a ride. We have a couple guests with us.
Hi.
Robert, John,
You.
why don't you guys go ahead and introduce yourself? Robert,
I'll do
go
your
ahead and
theme
go.
song, Robert.
Okay, go for it.
No, you have to.
Oh, I have to say where I work.
You
Okay,
just
yes.
do it.
So I'm Robert Rowley. I'm a security advocate for PatchStack.
Patch deck, get on the. Well, I didn't think of that in time. I realized that might not fit the code of conduct as soon as I started thinking it.
No, there's an explicit tag,
Oh,
right? We can
no, I
tag
got it.
explicit.
Patch deck,
Wait.
get on the core, patch deck. I did this last time.
There we
I just,
go.
Patch me
sometimes-
some more.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry. When has this show followed the code of conduct? Is that new or?
We'll fax you
listen
over a copy.
No, we have our own code of conduct.
We do? I'm not
Yeah.
aware of it.
Yeah, well, it's just, I don't, it mostly revolves around making sure guests are comfortable. And I really didn't
Say.
want to start.
We also have
I'm always
let-
uncomfortable, so it's totally not even a problem. It's totally
Let J-Trip
I'm-
say hello. Yeah.
My name's
Okay,
John,
yeah.
a WordPress core contributor. I think I'm relevant today because we're going to talk some security stuff. And so as a member of the security team, mostly for BuddyPress, VBPress, WordPress.org,
You're always
here
relevant.
to provide a little bit of core security insight if I can.
sweet.
Wonderful. So the reason that we have you two on today is because you were having an interesting discussion in Post Status Slack. We stole you out from under Post Status. Take that, Corey. Sorry. But you were having a really interesting conversation around both terminology, security terminology, and I don't know why I don't have this pulled up. Probably
Okay.
because this is my
You're
first
not as good
time.
as Tucker?
No, I mean,
I
who can be?
That was supposed to be like a pro Tucker comment. I forgot that it would also be like a anti-Cosper
It's fine.
comment. I didn't mean it like that. Sorry.
So really, a thing that I picked out of the conversation that the two of you were having was that as terminology becomes more universal, John, you were saying this, it intentionally also becomes less accurate and more broadly applicable.
I think so.
Every audience with their own perspectives and even colloquialisms likely deserve their own terminologies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think
And-
the background, right, Robert, do you want to talk a a little bit about, because I think you brought it up originally, right? Or pasted the link. Who was it that shared the link?
Yeah.
Was
About,
it Schneider link?
yeah.
Yeah, it was the Schneider link.
Oh, that was dank.
Oh, dang, that's right.
It goes by dank.
I don't have it up.
Dan.
Like, is that
Yeah,
a person
Dan
or
Mouse.
is that an adjective? I couldn't
It's
tell.
moniker. Yeah.
Okay, it was a noun. Got
Yeah.
it. Now, not
Yeah. So
an
what's the
advocate.
context? What was the link?
Although the name might
somebody
be
want to
better.
fill in the?
So it was a post by Bruce Schneier, which is he's a technologist. He's been around the technology game a long time. I think he had some sort of cryptography is behind, like Bruce Schneier is the guy behind that. So he's a big name in the field, and he basically said taxonomy of access control is a blog post he did. And he said, and it was specific. It was very specific for when like secrets are held.
Okay, wait,
in
hold on.
media.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that is so obviously a WordPress site. I can't even contain myself.
I love it.
quick open up /WP admin. Let's confirm.
I mean, do you even have to? It's so clear.
It's definitely
It might as well be in Kubrick.
He's designed this. This is at least
wait, there's an
$500 worth of design.
HTML, so maybe not. What's happening there? Oh yeah.
Oh, definitely.
Ooh, winner.
Yes.
Good call. So the post, though, the obvious WordPress post now, Bruce Schneier, WordPress user, he basically says this sensitive data, like keys, private information, can be considered these 4 states: safe, as in only the user has access to it, right? Only the appropriate parties have access. Lost, which means nobody has access to it anymore. Leaked, which means the user has access to it and third party has access to it. Who knows who that person is. Or theft, which is the user no longer has access to it and only a third party has access to it. It really helps.
We really don't want.
Right? If you think about it, crypto keys, right, are probably the best way to apply this. But any key, your WordPress website has secret keys on it too.
Since we're talking about words, I just really want to point out that I love the word adversary. I feel like we're in Sherlock Holmes a little bit over here with our adversaries. Okay.
I like the word evidently. I don't use it ever.
Redemption?
Evidently.
Oh, evidently.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it has a really concrete meaning if you think about it. It's evidence. Anyway, continue. Thank you.
I had no more to say on that.
Oh,
but actually, John, you added some more context to it with the White House version.
What I think words are hard and
so is math.
So math is also hard, and so I trying to. It's gutsy to try and come up with a suggestion of definitions of that everyone should try to think deeply about what we name these things, and then come to a consensus that these are the ones that we should use. And to pitch that out there is it takes a certain level of familiarity and guts to say in this context, we need to come up with definitions for these terms and have everyone kind of agree on them. And so it reminds me a little bit of what we do with WordPress stuff. And I tend to bring stuff back to that in general, but we don't really have stuff for WordPress, right? For WordPress security. There's CVEs and there's a whole lexicon of language that happens very specifically to the software security, but originally with WordPress core and building WordPress and using Track, which is a piece of software that WordPress has used to manage a project for a long time, and PHP used it, and a bunch of other projects use Track. But at first, there was a lot of confusion around the difference between priority and severity, and then what words go in which drop down to determine whether or not if something is important, it should be a high priority. But then I think everyone kind of had to imagine that maybe that wasn't always the case. And so
I love this stuff. It's so hilarious because literally, I mean, and this is the whole point of meta, the word meta, right? It's all of this stuff exists so in people's minds. And then you have to have so many other words to define the one word so that everybody thinks that one word is the same thing. And this is before we even talk about languages. This is just English.
Exactly. So I think I ended up linking to the paper that's up on the screen now from the Obama White House administration. They had come up with severity levels, and we came up with colors, right? It was white, green, yellow, orange, red, black, and there are some words, general definitions around it. But eventually, it's someone has to pitch it. They come up with a definition of what these levels mean. You sort of just map to what ends up being a schema, a schematic of what the levels are, and you've defined them. And so there's a whole website, schema.org, that is pretty much all about dedicated to defining what the shapes of things are or could or should be. A lot of people like to use schema.org or refer to it for a lot of things, and but it's not always the like canonical go-to for the shape that things should be. And part of open source sort of allows us to redefine the shapes of these things if we want to, and add and subtract things and fork them.
I think that is actually to the detriment of everyone, honestly. And I mean, not in related to security, but just in related to the project overall. There's been a lot of conversation about language. Obviously, full site editing is not really a security term at all, but it is, how does that get translated? What does that refer to? And that's been kind of taken on its own life. There's also happening, so much happens like under the radar in the meta, in the WordPress make world. It is wild. But there are some glossary projects that are being worked on. And there's both technical, so now there's technical developer glossaries, and then there's user glossaries, because the literal definition of the word changes depending on how you're using, if you're coming at it as a user or you're coming at it as a developer. And I think in the WordPress world, that free flowingness, like, let's just redefine it. And then it's like, whoever's on that team right now is like, here's what I think. Having that external source, or like, which is its own, and all that dialogue can happen there. Obviously, it's still not concrete, right? But like, at least having that external source could provide an anchor for the language that would allow it to be more, even just translated more simply, because then schema can get, that's being translated on its own. And so I think we do not take advantage or remember enough that exists.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right.
End monologue.
And there's a bunch of stuff like in that WordPress has adopted that, like, who knew what codex was necessarily before WordPress had codex.wordpress.org? Like, yeah, maybe it did, but like, once it became the thing, you were like, oh, and then like we all understood what taxonomies were eventually, maybe not through WordPress, but they're just all these sort of like words that you don't use in your day-to-day life unless you're a WordPress developer, and that to a person who is your average WordPress user / implementer / trying to learn where the code is and what it does and how it works, whatever else, that like these terms literally have no context. There's no connection. There's no meaning really to them and why they exist. And so for different audiences, we should have different names for things. And imagine what things are called internally at NASA versus what we end up with as a piece of technology that gets launched into the sky and whatever else. Like, these things naturally, I feel, are going to have and should have different names for different audiences. And it ends up being confusing for some of us and our listeners, maybe, who walk the line between being on or on both sides, or understand both sides of like a user and a developer or whatever else. So it means that we have to take care and to be explicit when we are referring to one thing or another with whatever audience it is that we're talking to. But like, you brought up the editor thing, and the editor thing I think is a good example of like the HTML editor is just a text area. Maybe it uses CodeMirror behind the scenes, but we don't necessarily refer to CodeMirror. But then the visual editor uses TinyMCE, and so there is a maintainer for TinyMCE. It is its own open source project, but it is referred to as the visual editor inside of WordPress. And we have a block editor, and a block editor uses a different piece of software called Gutenberg. And Gutenberg is its own project that has its own maintainers and people. And so when we refer to the different editors in WordPress, we should call them the block editor. We should call them the visual editor, because that's what they are to some people. But internally, when I'm talking with developers, I would talk about the Gutenberg project or the TinyMCE project or CodeMirror. Like, they're separate pieces of software for different audiences. And I get full site editing is a thing that everyone's trying to figure out. And there are all these names, and none of them are wrong. They are all relevant, but we need to decide or try to be explicit or intentional about who the audience is that we are using those words for, and then always use those terms with those people. Because once we don't, then people, something has two names and you don't know whether to call me John or James or J Trip or whatever, right? People get confused easily because there's just too many names for things. So
I don't know what to call you ever.
So
I'll just go with J Trip because
J Trip's
it's the
fine.
easiest. That's what I met you as, so I just stick with it.
it's interesting that you bring that up, John, because I just even earlier this week, we hired someone at work who works in product marketing, really smart, very like on top of product marketing and everything else. She built her site with WordPress. She used Elementor, hasn't even ever touched Gutenberg or anything like that. And she, as like one of the de facto like fountains of information that's available at the office, like she said, hey, do you have some time to help me figure out a Gutenberg thing? I said, yeah, sure. And the Gutenberg thing that she wanted me to help her figure out was, okay, so what is Gutenberg? What is the block editor?
Yeah, which part is what?
What is full site editing? What is the template editor? What is, and because there are no analogs for this in what she has been using in the silo of Elementor and WordPress that she's been using. And in a lot of cases, it came back to, well, yes, that is technically the block editor or Gutenberg, but it has a different name and it has a few different functions that aren't in. And it just, to somebody, and especially as we look at like WordPress growth and market share and stuff like that, something that
Hopefully.
I'm not too caught up in, but
hopefully we look at WordPress growth.
that some of these terms and not having them nailed down and kind of having them be so nebulous turns into a problem for the growth of WordPress. It's the reason that things like Wix and Squarespace and whatever else are just so fucking popular.
Yeah, I mean,
totally. Yeah.
Honestly, I believe that is part of it, because if we, they just call a thing whatever they want, and then that's what it is, for there's not that crossover of developer user that is so prevalent in WordPress. And there's also like whoever's developing on like Squarespace or Shopify, they don't care what the users call. Like it's not, they're like two whole worlds.
Well, and I think this is like why a lot of the time, Steve, I don't mean to cut you off, but
That's fine.
Like I think I can segue you into what you want to say, as I think I know what you're going to say. I don't know why I think that, but like this is why I think a lot of the times marketing teams think that this is why they want to be involved in things. Frankly, is because they are the ones that have the eye for what a thing should probably be referred to as publicly. And teams at Squarespace and Wix can go, hey, let's run this through marketing and see what it should be called. They have a name, they have a rollout plan, they have a thing. And so any piece of content that gets written will always refer to that thing consistently. And if you don't have someone who's there to help market the thing that you're building, or someone to at least explain what the guidelines are, and to look at what you're writing and typing before you hit publish and go, we don't call it that anymore. It's got to be called this. It's got to be capitalized. It's got to be whatever.
Right.
If it's just us building stuff, we're going to call it whatever we want. But if there's a separate team whose job it is to generally think that way, we need to, the WordPress, folks should probably do a better job, all of us together, of running those things past a team of people that do better at that. Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
It's okay. I was going to say, I stepped away for a second, so I apologize if this was covered, but even the term WordPress is misunderstood, right?
It was not covered. We did not touch that.
You ask somebody what WordPress is, and you can get multiple answers as to what WordPress is. Are we talking about .com, .org? And as soon as you say it, they go, what?
Yeah. And interesting, 2 points about marketing, because I kind of shadow in the marketing team a little bit, but there's been a lot of dialogue there about these kind of terms. The marketing team, even defining its own purpose, was just referring to the WordPress project. And part of my comments was that it's confusing. People don't think of the platform and the community as like the project. If you say the project, it's like, oh, it's just a platform. Like WordPress community is like its own entity. And so like what, it's not just even, do you mean .com or .org? It's also, do you mean, the project? Do you mean the greater ecosystem? Do you mean the community? Like what, like the actual software? Do you mean the make community? Because like even
do you mean automatic?
Yeah, because
No,
even
right,
in my
absolutely,
intro, right, that I've said for however many years, I make WordPress, teach WordPress, whatever. Like when I started saying that, I was not involved on the make team or the make world at all, really. And I meant I make it. Like I build WordPress. Like I build WordPress. I build stuff with WordPress. I make WordPressy stuff. So that's how I meant it back in the day. And then, it just, I make WordPress was even like a sticker, I think, that like make gave out at one point. Like, so even within my own world, my own sentence structure, those things mean different things. And
yeah, I was going to say, and to really touch on this, there was a conversation. Gosh, I wish I could remember the podcast. I'll make sure to put it in the show notes, where there was a gigantic discussion. I mean, there's been a discussion for years about what is a WordPress developer, and
or implementer, like Trade was saying.
Yeah, exactly. And really, I mean, these conversations we're hitting an interesting point in WordPress's trajectory. Like the software is almost 20 years old. And we're still having these arguments over what's a WordPress developer.
Well, and I think also it's really changing right now. Like, and I think that's why this is so relevant, because as full site editing kind of moves in that direction, right? That's really changing. And the stack of Gutenberg has changed. So like I used to consider myself a WordPress developer. And like now I'm like, I don't fucking know React. Really just, I haven't dug into it, and like I haven't done that professional development. And I'm like, am I an implementer now? Did I get demoted? Like I feel like I am now an implementer and not a developer. Well, it's a weird feeling. Like I didn't change; it changed.
Super weird. I don't know how you feel.
I was going to say, in the corporate world, it gets even worse, right? Because WordPress has its roots in blogging. So, you talk about WordPress in the corporate world, and right away, somebody says, "Oh, you mean the blog software?" No, I actually mean the current platform, right? I call it a platform or a framework, right? So yeah, I think it is greatly misunderstood.
And sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I used to hang out in the WordPress, or not in the WordPress, in just like the general computer security world, going with DEF CON. That's actually how I know Robert. And I remember initially when blogging was taking off, that it was effectively this thing of, I remember I used to kind of get clowned a little bit, because they're like, what, you want to go into blogging software, like blogs, this is not going to be a thing for very long. And you know what, WordPress has adapted with the times and has become more of a CMS as blogging has kind of receded and everything else. But I know we only have a few minutes left. We haven't really touched on security.
Well, I was going to say that actually, in terms of the standardization, like even when we just went on to that dude's site, whatever his name was, and I was like, oh, it's a WordPress site, and you're like, go to WP admin, right? Like obviously there are plugins and things you can do to screen that, because if you just can go to WP admin, right, that's why you get so many brute force attacks, right? Like on your admin. And people can go to your WP content and they can't go to that folder necessarily, but I always go and like get the full size of the image. If I'm pulling an image off, I just remove the tag.
Totally.
I know what the tags are going to be.
If you're borrowing an image from the site,
generally it means I'm taking it from a site that is a client site that they don't have anymore, and I'm stripping the web for stuff. That's generally what that means. But
so I have a question for Robert, but I think I'll segue us for the last 7 minutes back to security stuff. So what it reminds me of, or the terminology of all of it, reminds me of like lawyer speak, or ordinances and laws and all those things, where it doesn't have to be worded the way that it is, but it is an intentional choice to design the laws and ordinances and rules using language that is unique and difficult to understand or remember, and it can kind of be misinterpreted from every direction. And so in an open source context, I think that we can look at a piece of software like WordPress and to see that as software matures, humans naturally make it more complicated. It doesn't get easier. We just make it harder to use or understand and get involved in. It is just sort of how we end up operating as a group of people. So the security culture, having terms and definitions and approaches and styles and things, like the way that security teams generally tend to work or whatever else, has a little bit of that. It has some colloquialisms within the community, terms, names for things that are not approachable to an average person. They're like a person who doesn't understand
I agree.
software security.
If I can
Gatekeeping
give
by
an example.
obfuscation.
It's
So
not
I
that
would love to hear
obfuscation.
more
I give
from
the
Robert
example,
about-
and it happened this week. WordPress 6.02 is a security release.
Mm-hmm.
As it was communicated, because now you have different perspectives too, right? You have hosting providers with their security teams that need to know information quickly. You have website owners who need to know also what to do, what they need to do. And you have developers who, even before the announcement, they need to know how to triage and handle their security bugs appropriately. And this is where a lot of it comes into play. I think where we started off of was simply talking about severity of a security vulnerability in Gutenberg, but I'd rather use this 6.02 because there's a great example here. There is one of the 3 security bugs that were patched in 6.02 is a SQLI or SQL injection bug. We're already at a threshold where if you don't know security, you don't know what I'm talking about yet, but we're not done. There's still more to dig into. Now, like when you really get into the security thing, I have to start thinking, is it authenticated or unauthenticated? How much does it impact the site or the scope? And that we use a security terminology, use this calculator called CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System. I forgot. I wrote about it on the Patch Stack Weekly a couple weeks ago, but we score those things and it ends up giving us a score between 0 and a 10 or low to high or critical sort of thing. But again, this release had a high severity vulnerability in it, but it lacked proper context. It needed even more context than the CVSS score could apply because it was something that was core patched it, but the vulnerable code could only be introduced by a plugin or a theme who misused the function. So it's this thing like, how do we communicate that to the users? Because in the end of the day, what ended up happening this week was a bunch of WordPress users heard that there's a high severity security bug, and they might misunderstand that as exploitable, right? They might misunderstand that as my site's at risk. When in reality, this severity rating is kind of an internal security term where we use it to prioritize the bug. How fast do I need to get this pushed out, this bug pushed out or patched? And I agree, there could definitely be some better clarification, but unfortunately we end up using more words like I just did to try to really dig into, explain it to people, but having a framework or a schema, which there are other projects out there that do have schemas. Google is behind one of them right now, the open source vulnerability OSV schema, to talk about these things. But I don't even think their schema goes into it well enough to communicate to users.
Yeah, I was going to say Google, all of Google's programs are so developer focused. It is unfreaking believable. Like they are, like the Gmail team is like an island unto itself of user. And I think that's just because of familiarity. Like really Google just is, the developers at Google are very developer focused.
My main takeaway too to share with everybody is like, if you hear something's a high severity vulnerability, you might need to have somebody who knows how to look into security bugs, look into a little bit more for you, or there needs to be a little bit more communication going on to really clarify what does this mean. And in fact, I'm writing today the Patch Stack Weekly that's going to talk about 6.02's release and really how it's not a high severity, right? The context, the requirements to initiate an attack are just slim. And that can't be communicated. Not only did you
have to have, that bug was there, but you had to have the plugin or the theme that was there and an actor doing an exploitation of that, right? So it has the potential for, high exploitation, but like the likelihood of occurrence is not high.
Yeah, it's
Right.
not prevalent. It's not prevalent across every WordPress website. And I think even in the description in WordPress, the announcement, it says possible SQLI, which is like that one keyword. If you can key in on it, you'll know what they meant. But if you miss it, you're like, oh shoot, then you might think that it's a really bad issue. And maybe hopefully no hosting teams or site administrators were staying up this week trying to push this patch due to fear that a high severity vulnerability was affecting their sites, because there was more context.
That also gets out not just in terms of whether or not you're updating your site, but it gets out and contributes to the reputation of WordPress as being secure, insecure, because so many people are so black and white on is it secure or is it insecure, and don't understand the evolving nature of security, especially on the internet.
Well, and think of
generally,
we know,
right?
We know the inside baseball too, right? Like before WordPress, we know the terms and we know how the code works. And so imagine all around us, every news article that you read that says something similar, that is about the LastPass thing, all of these. And not just code stuff, but like government stuff, politics, whatever. Like you see these articles, and if you know, if you catch on to the words and phrases and you're part of that and you kind of pick up on it. But we as just average consumers it's not for us, kind of. Like we call it TV, but that there's a million other layers of things that happen behind TV to make TV work. You call it an iPhone, but there's a million things that have to go into making an iPhone work. Like your Notes app in your it uses an SQLite database underneath it, and all this stuff happens on the fly. You never have to touch it. But that jargon, those things matter to many people. They do not matter to your average typical user. So for WordPress stuff, I really can't really harp on it enough. I think that it is on us to like use the right words and names for things and correct ourselves and each other when we are like underscore doing it wrong, I guess, because it's just so easy to accidentally to do.
The game of telephone happens, and it just gets worse and worse as it gets further away from the originals.
Unfortunately, we are just past our 30 minutes, so I'm going to have to let J-Trip's thing be the final word. Thank you so much for
talk about it on Twitter.
Yes, please talk about it on Twitter. Put some comments down in YouTube, wherever you're most comfortable.
We hear you wherever it comes from. We'll listen.
I'm gonna hit the button the way that Tucker told me to hit the button, and hopefully this will be our outro.
Did it work?
I think it worked. All right.
On?
If you enjoyed what you saw today, please come over to WPwatercooler.com/subscribe. Add us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, YouTube, and Spotify, I guess.
Spotify.
Everybody have a great day.
Love ya.
Episode 22.
3. Is it ending?